Every war has an origin story that gets simplified down to a single date, a single invasion, a single moment when the world supposedly changed forever. But wars don't actually start on the day they're declared. They start years earlier, quietly, in the minds of desperate, humiliated, and increasingly radical men who convince entire nations to follow them. And the men who started the deadliest conflict in human history didn't begin as monsters. They began as a failed artist, an expelled political outcast, and a nation that simply ran out of resources. This is the story of how three completely different countries on three different continents arrived at the exact same destination. Let's start in Italy. In the early 1920s, in the wreckage of a war that was supposed to make the country stronger. Italy had joined the First World War because the Allied powers promised them substantial territory in return. But when the war ended and the peace treaty was signed, Italy received only a small fraction of what had been promised. The Allies, having gotten what they needed, quietly moved on. For a lot of ordinary Italians, this was written off as a disappointment. But for Italian nationalists, it became something much deeper, a national humiliation. They even had a name for it, a mutilated victory. It might sound dramatic, but consider what it actually meant. Italy had poured its entire economy, its labor force, and its young men into the war effort, expecting a substantial reward. Instead, they were left with runaway inflation, crushing debt, and a generation of grieving families. Add in mass unemployment, political chaos, and factories being seized by worker uprisings, and you have a country that felt like it was falling apart in real time. Into that chaos stepped a man who had spent most of his early career as a committed socialist and an outspoken opponent of the war. Then, somewhere along the way, he flipped his position entirely, arguing the war was actually necessary for the nation to grow stronger. This made him deeply unpopular with his former allies, and he was expelled from the socialist movement entirely. So he built something new. He called it fascism, a word that gets thrown around constantly in modern politics, even though very few people actually understand what it originally meant. At its core, fascism is built around one central idea: the nation comes before everything else, before political parties, before personal freedoms, before individual opinions, before the individual entirely. According to this ideology, people arguing over class, wealth, or ideology only weakens the country. The solution, as this movement saw it, was simple: stop fighting each other. Unify under the nation, and let one strong leader make the decisive calls that a slow, argumentative democracy couldn't make fast enough. On paper, that might not sound sinister. The obvious problem is the question nobody wants to ask out loud: who exactly decides what's best for the nation, and what happens to anyone who disagrees? At the time, a lot of wealthy Italians were genuinely terrified of communism spreading from Russia, where a revolution had already succeeded just a few years earlier. So when this new fascist movement started promising to restore order and crush the growing communist and worker uprisings, support poured in from business owners, war veterans, and nationalists exhausted by the chaos. And this is exactly where the cracks in the ideology start to show. Let's all unite under one leader sounds appealing right up until someone points out the obvious risk, that concentrating that much power in one person is dangerous by definition. Under this new movement, people who raised that concerns didn't get treated as political opponents anymore. They got treated as enemies of the nation itself. The movement's enforcers, an organized paramilitary group, began targeting opposition newspapers, breaking up strikes, and intimidating anyone who spoke against them, while the existing government proved too weak or too unwilling to stop it. By October of 1922, thousands of these paramilitary members marched together toward the capital. It wasn't quite an invasion. It was a show of force designed to intimidate the government into submission. And it worked. The sitting government wanted to bring in the military to demonstrate its own strength, but that required the king's approval, and the king refused to give it. Rather than risk widespread conflict, the government simply collapsed, and the king invited the fascist leader to become prime minister instead, even though the leader himself hadn't even personally taken part in the march. He'd been waiting it out in another city entirely, watching to see how things would unfold before stepping in to claim the position. Over the following decade, he consolidated more and more power, eventually ruling as an unquestioned dictator and Italy's fascist experiment became a working template that other nations would soon study very closely. Now shift the picture to Germany, a country dealing with a very different flavor of the same underlying problem. Where Italy felt like a winner who'd been shortchanged, Germany was a loser crushed under an almost unimaginable burden. The peace treaty that ended the war left them with reparations equivalent to trillions of dollars in today's money, stripped territory, a demilitarized industrial region, and a military capped at a fraction of its former size, with no air force allowed at all. Understandably, a lot of Germans were looking for someone to blame for their situation. That's where a failed artist and war veteran enters the picture, a man who had actually served with genuine bravery during the war, earning medals despite being wounded more than once. While recovering from one of those injuries, blind and bedridden, he received the news that Germany had surrendered. He was reportedly devastated and furious, and like a lot of radical veterans at the time, he refused to accept that the military had actually lost on the battlefield, believing instead that the nation had been betrayed from within. He started giving speeches, a lot of speeches. Eventually, he took over a small political party and transformed it into what would become the Nazi Party. Despite the name, this movement despised socialism and communism, spending much of its early energy directly targeting socialist opponents. The key difference between this movement and its Italian counterpart wasn't subtle, though. While the Italian version was primarily obsessed with national unity, this new German version fused nationalism with a toxic racial ideology, blaming the country's problems not just on political failures, but on entire groups of people, specifically targeting Jewish citizens with increasingly dangerous rhetoric. This is generally the specific, much darker meaning people are referring to when the word fascism gets used in its most serious historical sense. Following the same script as the Italian movement, this leader attempted his own show of force, gathering supporters and attempting to seize control of a regional government by force. It failed almost immediately, landing him in prison and getting his party temporarily banned. It might have ended there entirely, if not for a global economic collapse in 1929 that hit Germany harder than almost anywhere else. Suddenly, a man who had sounded unhinged to most people a few years earlier started sounding a lot more reasonable to a desperate, economically devastated population. As conditions worsened, his popularity climbed in almost perfect correlation, and by 1933 he had accumulated enough support to become chancellor. From there, he followed the exact same playbook, dismantling political opposition, consolidating total control, and installing himself as an unquestioned dictator. Then, he looked at the long lists of restrictions imposed after the war and started treating it as a checklist to violate, one item at a time, rebuilding the military, reconstructing an air force, moving troops back into demilitarized territory. And the response from the other major powers, who had the ability to stop this early and decisively, was essentially nothing. That lack of response only emboldened him further. If moving troops into restricted territory carried no consequences, why not annex a neighboring country entirely, under the justification of reuniting German-speaking populations? The other major powers issued a stern warning and then, ultimately, allowed it to happen anyway, hoping that appeasement would prevent further escalation. Emboldened once again, he set his sights on a neighboring country's border region, using the presence of a German-speaking minority as justification for demanding its annexation, despite that same territory being critical to the country's own defenses. In a now infamous meeting, the other major powers agreed to let him take that region, on the condition that he leave the rest of the country alone. He agreed, and within months, that promise turned out to be worthless. The rest of the country was absorbed anyway, its defenses already gone, its position undermined by a promise that was never going to be honored to begin with. While all of this was unfolding across Central Europe, a separate conflict had already ignited a preview of what was coming. A failed military uprising in Spain in 1936 spiraled into a brutal civil war between opposing political factions, and before long, half of Europe had picked a side. The German and Italian movements backed one faction, while the Soviet Union backed the other, effectively fighting a proxy war on Spanish soil while simultaneously negotiating with each other back home. That negotiation resulted in a non-aggression pact between Germany and the Soviet Union, publicly promising a decade of peace between the two nations. Privately, the agreement included a secret provision dividing Eastern Europe between them in anticipation of exactly the kind of expansion that was about to happen. But there's a third piece to this puzzle on the opposite side of the globe that gets left out of most tellings of this story entirely. While Italy was chasing national pride and Germany was chasing revenge, Japan was dealing with an entirely different kind of pressure. The country had industrialized rapidly, building a substantial military and manufacturing base, but had discovered, somewhat too late, that it didn't have nearly enough natural resources to sustain any of it. The solution its military leadership settled on was resource acquisition through territorial expansion into neighboring regions. Before launching an invasion, though, it helps to have a justification, and the Japanese military found one, or, more accurately, engineered one. An incident involving a railway, widely believed to have been staged by the Japanese military itself, was blamed on Chinese forces and used as the pretext to seize a large, resource-rich region of northeastern China. From there, expansion continued. A second staged incident became the justification for a full invasion further into Chinese territory, eventually reaching major cities, including the capital at the time. What happened in the aftermath, particularly in that captured capital, involved such extreme and widespread cruelty toward the civilian population that most historical accounts describe it only in the broadest terms. The details are simply too severe to responsibly go into here. What matters for this story is that it represented one of the earliest and most devastating chapters of what would soon become a truly global conflict, years before most Western accounts consider the war to have properly begun. So here's the pattern, laid out across three completely separate nations, three separate grievances, and three separate paths that all converged in the same place. A nation that felt cheated out of a victory it believed it earned. A nation crushed under debt and humiliation, looking for someone to blame. And a nation that ran out of the resources it needed to sustain its own ambitions. Three different wounds, three different men stepping into the vacuum each one created, and three movements that each promised the exact same thing: unity, strength, and a return to greatness if only everyone would fall in line behind one leader. Every single one of them was allowed to grow, largely because the rest of the world kept hoping the problem would resolve itself, or simply didn't want to be the one to intervene first. By the time anyone was ready to stop it, all three paths had already merged into a single global catastrophe. The war didn't begin with a single invasion. It began years earlier, in the quiet, desperate conditions that made ordinary populations willing to follow extraordinary men into catastrophe. And that's usually how it works. The villains rarely arrive announcing themselves. They arrive promising to fix everything, and by the time anyone realizes what's actually happening, it's already too late to stop it quietly.